This is the story of Marydyer, who was the first woman to be executed in the American colonies for her religious beliefs.
I was born in England just a few years after the infamous Gunpowder Plot, where Guy Fawkes and other Catholic conspirators tried to blow up the Houses of Parliament. My family were members of the Reformed Church, and naturally were suspicious of those who still clung to the old church. Surely any child growing up when I did knew that those who still held allegiance to the religion of Rome were held in suspicion, and not without cause. I married William Dyer, a fishmonger. We set sail for Boston in 1635.
Mary and William were Puritans, and they became members of the Boston Church upon their arrival in the colonies. John Wilson was the minister of the Boston Church and a strong believer in the doctrine of works. This was the belief among Puritans that regardless of your actions on earth, your fate is determined by God before you are born. God elects or chooses a special few who will be righteous and eventually ascend to heaven.
Left wondering who were God's chosen few, some of us became frustrated with the limits of this philosophy.
A new minister, John Cotton, arrived in the colony, and his ideas about the doctrine of grace began to spread. This theology loosened the idea of predetermined election and focused instead on the belief in Jesus as the basis for salvation.
Another woman, Anne Hutchinson, supported Cotton, and I attended her house for weekly religious meetings and services. At first, there were only women at these meetings, and I was grateful to finally have the chance to participate in religious discussion. Free grace resonated with me and with many others who believed that a faith in Jesus as Lord allows for anyone to have salvation.
A couple of years later, in 1636, a new minister named John Wheelwright arrived in Boston. Like Cotton, Wheelwright believed in the doctrine of grace. Now, with both Cotton and Wheelwright in agreement with the doctrine of grace and the original minister, John Wilson, firmly supporting the doctrine of works, tensions in the church began to rise. In those days, religion and politics were closely tied together, and the growing schism in the Boston church between the doctrine of works and the doctrine of grace attracted the attention of the general court. This became known as the Antinomian controversy.
Disagreement in the church became so pronounced that a day of fasting was called for in January of 1637, but if this was meant to help matters, it had quite the opposite effect. The Reverend Wilson was away in England, so the Reverend Cotton spoke in the morning, and then the Reverend Wheelwright spoke in the afternoon. To those of us who believed in free grace, his words seemed mild and full of good sense, but those who supported Reverend Wilson were very offended. The matter was taken up by the general court, who were not at all pleased with how their day of fasting had turned out. On the 9th of March, 1637, they found the Reverend Wheelwright guilty of contempt and sedition.
Wheelwright was not without his supporters. 60 members of the Boston Church signed a petition in his support. It wasn't the numbers that decided the matter, however. In May, there was an election. Governor Vane had wanted to read the petition before the election, but those present insisted upon holding the election first. The result was that those magistrates who had supported Wheelwright were all replaced, and John Winthrop was the new governor. Then they passed a law that no newcomers could stay in the colony for more than 3 weeks without the court's permission, which meant that they could make sure that only people who agreed with them would be allowed to live in Boston.
That summer, the church elders held meetings. It was clear that they sought to deny the doctrine of grace, but my friends and I held firm to our convictions. If Governor Winthrop thought that we would turn away from our faith, he was much mistaken.
In November of 1637, the court was again in session. Wheelwright was tried and found guilty by the court of contempt and sedition. He was banished from the colony and given 2 weeks to leave Boston.
Later that year, my friend Anne Hutchinson was tried before the general court. Governor John Winthrop was opposed to Anne's theology, and she lost support after his election. She was banished from the colony.
After Anne's trial, the 60 people who had signed the petition in support of Wheelwright, including Mary's husband William, were disenfranchised and disarmed. Anne was held in custody, and because she refused to abandon her religious beliefs, she was tried for heresy. She defended herself but was still excommunicated in March of 1638.
Anne was my friend, and as I watched her leave her trial, I took her hand. Anne wanted women to be able to participate in religion and question theological matters, values which we shared. I knew that Governor Winthrop feared Anne's leadership, and I held my friend's hand in solidarity and in recognition of the important work she had done for her community.
Mary holding Anne's hand had caused quite a stir in the colony. Governor Winthrop took particular interest in this event and decided to investigate a stillbirth that Mary had suffered 5 months prior. Since Puritans believed that God pre-selected those who were saved, they often looked for any sign of God's favor or lack thereof. So this investigation was intended to make it known that Mary was not one of God's elected few. Winthrop went so far as to exhume the infant's body and report that it had severe deformities, likely exaggerating to make Mary look as unfavorable as possible. Shortly thereafter, William and Mary moved to Rhode Island and helped to establish the colony at Newport.
We felt refreshed by the religious freedom of Rhode Island, but churches were still run by men. I knew that I had important things to say and meaningful contributions to make to the church.
William Dyer played an important role in the Rhode Island colony, which was not without its own political issues. Mary traveled to England in 1651, leaving behind her 6 children. It is still unclear why she made this journey, but she left before William made his own trip to England to oppose William Cottington, who was against the unification of the settlements into what is now Rhode Island. Mary remained in England for about 5 years. Not long before, George Fox had founded the Quaker religion. Quakers believed that men and women alike were inherently spiritual and could have a personal relationship with God.
While in England, I met George Fox, who encouraged women and men to preach and believed that each individual has a relationship with God. We agreed that Puritan ideals caused power to become too centralized within the church. The people should be ruled by a government that is separate from the church. I was grateful to have found a religion that aligned with my views, and I converted to Quakerism.
Quakers were often persecuted, and in no place was this more true than the Massachusetts colony. The Boston Church saw Quakers as a serious threat to their Puritan order, and when the first Quakers arrived in 1656, they endured a variety of punishments, including whippings, the stock and pillory, imprisonment, and even having their ears cut off.
I returned to Boston in 1657 with my friend Anne Burden, who needed to settle the estate of her late husband. I was soon recognized as a Quaker and thrown in jail. My husband William secured my release. He was sworn not to allow me to speak to any other person in the colony on our return home. In the eyes of the Boston Church, as a woman, I could not do something if my husband did not allow it. But we Quakers understand that men and women are equals in the eyes of God.
Mary was undeterred by numerous arrests and continued to spread her Quaker message throughout New England. On some occasions, she was arrested when she was coming to visit with and comfort other Quakers who had suffered the severe punishments that were imposed on Quakers, like being whipped or having their ears cut off. There were more and more Quakers in the colony, and this was not a comfortable thing for the Boston magistrates. On the 19th of October, 1658, they passed a law saying that Quakers would be banished from Massachusetts on pain of death.
Word reached me that in June of 1659, 2 of my Quaker brethren, William Robinson and Marmaduke Stevenson, had again been arrested in Boston whilst all on their mission from the Lord. I knew full well the harsh laws that had been passed, but I had to go to Boston to give comfort to these men. I was imprisoned with them, and on the 19th of October, we were all 3 tried before Governor Endicott. We explained our mission from the Lord, but the governor was unmoved, and we were all 3 sentenced to death.
Mary Dyer, you shall go from hence to the place from whence you came, and from thence to the place of execution, and there to be hanged until you are dead.
The will of the Lord be done.
Take her away.
Yea, and joyfully I go.
The date for the executions was set as the 27th of October, 1659. William Robinson, Marmaduke Stevenson, and Mary Dyer were led to the place of execution.
I walked to the gallows with my 2 Quaker brothers, holding each by the hand. We tried to move the spirits of the assembled crowds with our words, but the soldiers beat their drums constantly so as to drown out the sound of our voices. I watched, and they hanged Robinson. I watched, and they hanged Stevenson. Then it was my turn to mount the gallows. I stood calmly with the noose around my neck and waited to join my Quaker brothers.
At the last minute, a reprieve was announced for Mary. This had been decided earlier, but was not announced until the moment before she was due to be executed. Governor Endicott had likely sought to soften public reaction to the execution by sparing Mary, but in this he was disappointed. For her part, Mary was very clear on her intentions. She spent the winter among other Quakers, but returned to Boston in May 1660, determined that the authorities be forced to either change their unjust laws or be forced to hang a woman. She was arrested and brought before Governor Endicott, where they had this exchange. Are you the same Mary Dyer that was here before?
I am the same Mary Dyer that was here the last general court.
You own yourself a Quaker, will you not?
I own myself to be reproachfully so called.
Sentence was passed upon you, the last general court, and now likewise you must return to prison, and there remain till tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Then thence you must go to the gallows, and there be hanged till you are dead.
This is no more than what thou saidst before.
But now it is to be executed. Therefore prepare yourself tomorrow at 9 o'clock.
I came in obedience to the will of God to the last general court, desiring you to repeal your unrighteous laws of banishment on pain of death, and that same is my work now, an earnest request, although I told you that if you refused to repeal them, the Lord would send others of his servants to witness against them.
On June 1st, 1660, Marydyer was once again led to the place of execution. This time she was executed, though those present did try to get her to repent her Quakerism and so save her life. They said that if she would not, she was guilty of her own blood. She refused and told them,
Nay, I came to keep blood guiltiness from you, desiring you to repeal the unrighteous and unjust law of banishment upon pain of death, made against the innocent servants of the Lord. Therefore, my blood will be required at your hands who willfully do it. But for those that do, as is in the simplicity of their hearts, I do desire the Lord to forgive them. I came to do the will of my Father, and in obedience to his will I will stand, even to the death.